I'm Clarence McIntosh. I'm in the library, Bidwell Mansion, with Mr. Ted Meriam and Mr. John Nopel. Both of these gentlemen are Chico residents. Both of them have been students of the Bidwells for several years now. They've had a great interest in the lives of both John and Annie Bidwell. And we'd like to talk about the significance of the Bidwells. John, I'm wondering what you would say is the significance of John Bidwell in his early life, as in the 1840s and 1850s.
During that period, it became very evident in a number of ways that John Bidwell's leadership role was beginning, going back to his early teaching days in Ohio. He sought to improve himself, which he did. Later, as he became a part of the Bartleson wagon train, the first that was to come to California, he became a leader in that capacity. And then during
I think he was secretary of that association.
That's right.
And
That's right.
Sort of helped get the party, the propaganda at least for the party going in 1840.
But even more than that, I understand that Bartleson himself was not the leader that maybe we'd like to believe he was, and Bidwell even had to take over an active role of leadership in that train as it came to California. And then, of course, after his arrival in California in 1841, he became involved in the life of pre-statehood California, to the point where people turned to him for leadership in many different ways. So I like to think of him as one of our real early leaders, even before California was a state.
Mm-hmm. I think I'd have to add that in reference to the pre-American era in California, that I'd have to consider John Bidwell as one of the important sources that historians have turned to. I can see the influence in work after work, as I've read them. The descriptions that John Bidwell gave of Mexican California in his Echoes of the Past have been quoted or summarized frequently by authors since then, and I think he's had a profound influence on the view that historians take of what life was like in Mexican California.
I'd certainly have to agree with that. I don't think that there were many early Californians, early at any time really in our country's history, where better records were kept. We turn to his diaries, his correspondence, and the things that he's done. I think they're just fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, in regard to the gold rush, does John just play in it, or is he just a part of it, or does he play an important role in it? What do you think?
Had the fortunate part of being on the spot at the very beginning. He was privy to the discovery within literally almost hours, or certainly no more than a day or two after the discovery, and before any general announcement had been made. And not only that, but he had been told on several occasions during the some 7 or 8 years that he'd been in California, that there was gold here. He'd been told so by native Californians and by Indians even. And I think that this helped materially in his deciding to go see if there's any up in the Feather River. And in other words, he was able to strike gold early, really, in 1848. But I think one of the unique things about Bidwell in respect to gold is that apparently, and there's no real record of it, but apparently after he had secured what he thought was enough to establish himself in a grand way in agriculture, he just turned away from gold. Now, there are records of where he was involved in mining company ventures, probably small ones that weren't successful in later years. But he didn't hang in there, as we would say today, with the gold rush. When he had what he felt was enough, he pulled out. And, of course, bought the initially the 22,000 acres from William Dickey.
Does either of you think that in Chico at the present time that we're likely to exaggerate the significance of the Bidwells because of the fact that Bidwell Mansion is here and Bidwell was a founder of Chico?
No, I don't think we're likely to exaggerate it. I think we're fortunate in having these reminders here, and with those reminders, the opportunity to express more adequately and I think more clearly the importance of John Bidwell, particularly in the history of California, and to a considerable extent Mrs. Bidwell later. Of course, she didn't come to California until 1868, but I think that John Bidwell's relative position of leadership was greater in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s than it was in the latter 30 years of his life.
Well, now, if we look at at what Mr. and Mrs. Bidwell did, or what kind of roles they played here in the Chico area, I've mentioned the founding of the city of Chico, or the laying out of the first
Right.
Town plat by John Bidwell. Now, are there other things that you can see that would be important for?
Well, it seems to me that after what is now the city was laid out by John Bidwell, he just didn't drop it, because at that point he wanted to be sure that it was a success. And so some of the things that he did initially, I think, were very important. For example, he gave plots of land, that is, small building lots, to anyone who would come in and build a home. He gave sizable lots of land to the various denominations so that churches could be built. He gave, too, the first lots of land for schools and for other public enterprises, things that would be of interest to the people and of value to the people as they came here. And so I think this is very important as we think of Bidwell the man. He could have just dropped everything and said, all right, folks, here we go. But he didn't do that, and he went ahead, and I'm sure we'll talk about his very wonderful gift as we got underway with the university a little later.
I think, John, that we should regard his gifts perhaps from two viewpoints. One would be altruistic. It was the right thing to do, and it was a generous thing to do. But I think also there was here was a man of considerable vision. For instance, the reason for founding the town and laying out the community, which was actually laid out by map in 1860, was because he recognized that this ranching operation had gotten so large that a town was inevitable. But he was enough of a businessman, albeit not too successful at times, to recognize that the more he could do to encourage the development of the community, the more it could mean to his agricultural enterprise. So I think there's a twofold, let's say, reason for his generosity to this community in the early days. He wanted this thing to be well established.
Well, I've been impressed too with the vision which this man had, and I think the vision showed in a number of different ways. Well, we've all read, for example, of his writings and in his speeches with respect to agriculture and the importance of irrigation. Here was a man who saw the importance of irrigation, my goodness, several decades before others tended to see it. And he spoke of irrigation as far as agriculture. I was interested not too long ago in reading about his viewpoints with respect to equal rights for women way back there,
That's
you know,
right.
And here we are now 100 years later, not quite, but just about 100 years later, and still this is a major issue here in America and in California, and yet this was no question in his mind at that time.
I think he was somewhat encouraged in that viewpoint by the fact of the person he married. I think really that it wasn't a case of, just saying, well, gee, because my wife believes in this, I should too. I think he recognized the validity, but was encouraged to be more outspoken probably than most men of the period because of her intense interest in having women have a real opportunity to accomplish things other than just in the home.
Well, now, of the reminders that we have in Chico today, what do we have other than just Chico itself that would identify the significance of John Bidwell particularly?
Well, of course, I guess there are 2 or 3 visible reminders that we have that people see almost daily, namely the Bidwell Park, which was a gift to Mrs. Bidwell after the General's death, and then we have the mansion here. But the thing that I'm always impressed with is, of course, the fact that agriculture, as started by John Bidwell, has come down through the years as our #1 industry. It's the backbone not only of Chico and of Butte County, but of course of the Great Valley area. And I think without the start that it got under John Bidwell, that we may never have reached the point that we have reached at this time in our history.
Well, now, there were other big ranchers in the area. What makes John Bidwell stand out?
Well, of course, he was #1, the great experimenter, but he was, I guess we'd have to say, a doer rather than a talker, too, and he was willing to bring in a variety of crops. He was a great believer in diversification of agriculture. He was unwilling to just plant wheat and let it go at that, but he immediately started out in a wide variety of other things, and of course that's, again, I think one of the things that makes the Great Valley such a great agricultural area in this day.
John, you mentioned that he was a doer perhaps, or perhaps not a talker. I'm going to challenge that just slightly in relation to his role in agriculture, because particularly in the 1850s and to some extent in the early 1860s, he was the leading spokesman for agriculture in California through his avid interest and participation in the Agricultural Society, which was established, I think, in a semi-official way by the legislature. And he was very much the leader. The records show that quite clearly, because here was an articulate man, and he really talked for all of agriculture in the early days of agricultural development in this state. And since he had such a splendid example of his own skill in agricultural development, it was only natural, I think, that people looked to him for leadership, because he was, again, an articulate spokesman for agriculture.
Well, time and time again, the Agricultural Society, which did eventually take on the name of the California State Agricultural Society, would invite Bidwell back even into the 1880s.
True.
To have him give the annual address at the State Fair. And this was not only an honor to him, but also he had something to say.
Well, this is really one of the most significant records that we have of the importance of John Bidwell's leadership in and for agriculture in California. That is particularly in the Central Valley.
Well, now, do you think John was interested in the donating of the land for the normal school here because he had been a school teacher, or is this building up Chico?
No, this would again be a wonderful example of the sort of thing that he would do. He was a great benefactor in terms of education as well as religion and everything else that was good for Chico. And so when the chips were down, if I can use that expression, and it became evident that maybe Chico was only in the running, he came forth with, of course, the very generous gift of any place on my rancho, really, you can have for this new northern branch of the normal school. And with that sort of attitude, of course, then the legislature did turn to Chico, and this site was accepted. And so again, I think he was interested in making Chico a better place, but also he was interested in the people of the area and not only of Chico, but of the Northern California area in bringing this institution to the area.
Well, there's no question of his absolute firm belief in the value of education. This is demonstrated from when he was really a teenager in Ohio. His personal quest for education is above average by considerable. And I think that the gift of the 15 acres, wasn't that it, 15 acres, Clarence? I think so. The original gift is perhaps one of the most significant things that ever happened in Chico as time has gone along. And it becomes, I think, increasingly important because certainly the presence of California State University Chico in this community is of increasing significance all the time to all of northeastern California, as well as to the state as a whole. And had Bidwell not made that one generous move, Chico might have been utterly different today, because that could have gone to Red Bluff, Marysville, Redding, Willows. All four of those communities were most anxious to get the northern branch of the normal school. And it was the gift of the land, we're told, that tipped the scales. Of course, there's legend about this, which may or may not be really correct, that he was in the east at the time, and his ranch manager wired that it was down now to the giving of the land, and he supposedly wired back and said, "Give anything but my doorstep." And legend is that he was a little aggravated when he returned home and discovered that his favorite and prized cherry orchard was where this place was to be located. That's legend.
Yes. I think another gift which he made, and to me it's important, although it lost its significance because it was never developed to its maximum, and that was the gift of what is now included as part of the Bidwell Park, which he made to the State Department of Forestry. Now here's again another visible gift, a thing that's come down through the years as we drive through Bidwell Park and we see the redwoods and the other trees, the cork oaks and so on that are planted there. We tend to forget that this was initiated by him way back in the 1880s as a gift in an effort. Again, he made that, as I understand, simply as an offer. When he heard that the Forestry Department was looking for a site, he came forth voluntarily and said, "Look, how about right here?" And they chose this site for this experimental work. I only wish that it had been developed as I'm sure he intended that it be developed.
Well, how fortunate it was, though, that it happened to be adjacent to what later became Bidwell Park.
Well, this is one of the first two forestry experiment stations in the western part of the United States. Mm-hmm. The other one was established at Santa Monica at about the same time. Well, now about Mrs. Bidwell. What kind of role does she play in the life of Chico?
Of course, we know that the Bidwells were married in 1868 and came here. The mansion had been finished, and they were able to move directly into the mansion as a husband and wife, and I guess it was the following day that she was taken out to visit the Machukta village of Indians and immediately embarked upon a lifelong work with those people. And I think that, of course, this was one of her main roles during her early years here at the mansion. I think it's significant, too, that it was only 3 months after her arrival that she probably through her influence was influential in getting the Presbyterian Church founded and established in August of that year. These two things come to mind as being things that she got underway immediately following her arrival here at the mansion. There were things that developed later on, particularly after the general had passed away in 1900, which found her very enthusiastically involved in, such as her role in the temperance movement and that sort of thing. But I was thinking of the initial things which she became involved in.
I think there's another thing that's it's a little nebulous, but I'm very confident it was there. I think she introduced into this community a certain cultural tone
Right.
that might have been much later coming on the assumption that no one else like her would have arrived, because she had the benefit of Washington, D.C. background, which was certainly one of the seats of culture, if you please, in this country at that time. And here she'd moved from really quite a city to a tiny country village way out there somewhere. But she brought into the community that background of hers that really was important. I think it encouraged other women in Chico at the time to perhaps become interested in what we would now call cultural activities.
And of course, we know that the mansion was the center of Northern California.
Oh, yes.
Activities, culture, and all sorts of things were going on in and around the Chico area during those early years.
John, you mentioned her strong interest in the temperance movement following the general's death. She also had a pretty strong interest prior to his death. Mm-hmm. And I think had already become recognized in temperance organization circles as a leader and a person who could be of considerable influence. Because certainly she was nationwide known, really, in that respect.
She becomes certainly a very active regional leader. She serves in state office. She then becomes even delegates to an international convention in regard to the temperance movement at a later time. So I think this is probably the most important cause that she embarked upon in her career. And she was in advance of her time, I think, in terms of that is in relation to most women, because she was willing to step out and take a leadership role.
She was a strong person, and that's evident from the letters that we have. Unfortunately, there are a great many letters of hers that are still available, letters that were written prior to their marriage. She was a strong person, very determined.
I think it's also interesting that she was able to carry on the work of the rancho, probably not in the same way that the general did during his lifetime, but after his death, of course, she found herself having these large holdings on her hands, and of course she, I think in a very businesslike way, proceeded to, in many respects, subdivide, to sell, to operate and maintain the properties in a financially successful way.
Well, she had some very good advisors at that time, notably an attorney named F.C. Lusk, also her nephew, Guy Kennedy, and I think to some degree Colonel Royce, who was the manager of the rancho at the time of Bidwell's death, and he stayed quite a while. I think, though, she was able to sift out good decisions from the advice given to her by these people. I, like you, give her a lot of credit for that, but she certainly had some strong and good advisors.
I think she could have just turned away, following his sudden death, and not have proceeded as she did in an orderly fashion.
Well, yeah, but by that time, John, I think she had herself developed a real love for this community. And it wasn't a case of, gee, where will I go now?
No.
She stayed right here. And then also, there was the financial problem of settling the general's estate, because he was frequently in rather heavy debt, and he was at the time of his death. Things had to go on. They had to be done in the right way in order to meet the obligations.
Now let's look at her brief time at John Bidwell's political career. Is there anything that you see significant about it? He was, in one sense, a notably unsuccessful politician. He ran for governor in the state 5 times, and yet was never elected. Can you see significance in his role as a politician?
I don't know whether this is significant or not, but an interesting thing to me about Bidwell was his dissatisfaction with each political party that he embraced, because he seemed to stay a while and then he'd move to another one. Here's one of the few men, I believe, that were, and I think I'm right about this, he was present as a delegate at the first National Convention, which nominated Stephen Douglas to run against Lincoln. And 4 years later, he was present as a delegate to the Republican convention that nominated Abraham Lincoln. And in California, there's, what, 5 or 6 different party affiliations. Some parties have long gone out of existence. But I think he felt a citizen obligation. I think he was that type of politician. And I think he had no real personal aspirations for government leadership, but he had a duty feel, a real citizen duty feel. And I think this is the reason that he finally chose to serve just the one term in Congress, because certainly he could have been reelected, but he chose not to. Love for the ranch, California, was probably the first consideration. Secondly, there might have been this in his mind: I have served, I have done my duty as a citizen. Someone else now may assume the same role, and I'll go back to what I love doing best.
I think the congressional career of John Bidwell is one that some of us need to do some more research on, but I do think his introduction of the legislation for the California and Oregon Railroad in the House of Representatives is probably the most important single act that he undertook while he was in Congress. As state senator in the first state senate of California, does John play an important role?
Well, I don't recall anything specific there, except that he was in that initial legislature, which got California off the ground, so to speak, as it became a state. And of course, there were a multitude of problems, including a broad spectrum of things, issues, and so on that this new state had to face. And so here he was as one of the leaders chosen by the people to get us involved in statehood. He was, we might be interested to know, one of the ones that helped to select the original 27 counties of the state of California. It's interesting to note that these 27 have now become 58 over the years. But he was involved in the selection and the boundaries of those counties as the state was initially set aside.
Well, it's long been noted by historians that the first legislature had the greatest opportunity and also the greatest challenges, and that the first legislature of California did really rather well given the circumstances under which the members were having to work at that time.
I think he must have been quite effective when he was a state senator, very effective probably, because I would judge that by the laudatory comments in writing later by contemporaries of the period. I think of one particular, that general period, and that's Will S. Green of Colusa, who was pretty much the father of, let's say, real irrigation systems in this part of the state. But Will Green apparently had a very strong admiration for Bidwell as a community leader, as a state leader. And that's just one example. I think there are many others. Had he not been a good leader in the Senate, I somehow think that that kind of comments would not have been so laudatory and so frequent and have spread over so many years.
Bidwells appears to have ended his political career as presidential candidate for the Prohibition Party. Right. Was he just chosen as the most important figure, or as the person who would attract the most votes, or
I've often wondered about that, Clarence. I've often wondered. I've even wondered, and I maybe shouldn't say this out loud, but I will. I've often wondered if perhaps the prominence of his wife in the temperance movement was a factor in his choice to be a candidate, because in those days, obviously, a woman would not be. I feel that his interest in the Prohibition Party and his comparative prominence in it came from two sources. One, the dedication of his wife to the temperance movement, and secondly, his own endorsement and belief in the rightness of it. The most interesting oddity, I think, about his presidential campaign. And first, let's make this remark, and it's so that up to the time of that election, including that election, he received the most votes ever received for president by a candidate of that party. And I'm not completely positive of this, but I believe that it was the high of all time. I think I checked that once, and it was. But the unique thing about the campaign, and mind you, this was back in 1892. You don't have communication like we do today. He never left the state of California while candidate for President of the United States on what was one of the prominent political parties. That, to me, is just unique. I think that is testimony to the strength of his reputation and possibly testimony to the character of the man and the general public respect throughout the country that this California leader had.
Well, pursuing that just a little bit, it's my understanding that he was chosen by the party. In other words, he didn't actively
this is correct,
solicit
this is right.
The nomination. He was chosen by the party, and then he accepted with his appropriate acceptance of the nomination. So that here again, I think it speaks for the reputation that you were speaking about a moment ago.
Well, now, if we think of the Bidwells in their total work, why should we have Bidwell Mansion? Why should we maintain it as a state historic monument?
There are two reasons, Clarence. To me, they're quite obvious. One, and I guess it's the one that captures the public interest more than anything else, is the grandeur of this particular building. As we're sitting here, this building is now 111 years old. Yes, that's right.
That's right.
111 years old. It's in beautiful condition, thanks to the restoration work and everything. But it's such an outstanding, fine example of what we could almost call elaborate living in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. Certainly an example of most gracious living. That has interest because there aren't very many around like this. But the other thing is, and I think this is perhaps why we're talking here today this way, is that it serves as a focal point for a better interpretation of the life of John and Annie Bidwell as leaders in the development of California. You frequently need a focal point to really grasp the work of a leader of days gone by. It's just like Sutter's Fort really is a significant thing for two reasons. Its uniqueness, it's an example of what life was there, but also it's the focal point around which we learn about Captain John Sutter and what he did for California. I think the same thing applies here. It's a twofold purpose, this mansion.
Well, Chico is certainly fortunate, I think, in that it
very fortunate.
has the mansion here, and we can look at it and we can get a sense of roots.
That's right.
Something that I think is missing among so many of us in present-day society.
And something that I believe is now reviving in general public interest. I really feel that in the last 10 years or so, there's a very much of an increase in, particularly in young people, in learning about their heritage. And I think this is great.
As far as the mansion is concerned, I think it's important to note, too, that the Bidwells were just more than willing. They sought ways in which to share their hospitality with people not only from afar, but right here at home. And they, for example, would have the normal school students here on a Sunday afternoon or a Sunday evening, inviting people from the community in to share their hospitality here at the mansion. And so it became a center not only from points afar, but from right here at home.
Well, various national figures visited the mansion too.
Yeah,
on the other
right.
end of the slide here. Today, considerable capital is made out of President Carter's visits to homes overnight. Well, in a different way, President Rutherford B. Hayes visited here and spent a night or two here. A frequent visitor, incidentally, of real importance and prominence was John Muir. John Muir and John Bidwell were great friends, and both believed in what the other was doing, very much so.
I'd like to tell you a story that happened. It's an actual incident from last Saturday. A little girl, about 5 or 6 years old, appeared in the Butte County Library, and she held back a bit, and then she went up to one of the librarians and said, "Do you know what I did today?" And the librarian said, "No, I don't know what you did today. What did you do?" She said, "I got to make butter. Butter over in Bidwell Mansion."
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that really casts a certain significance on the mansion and the experience here, because we can recreate, to a degree, the experiences of people of previous
That's
generations on this site.
That's why the interpretive aspect of the mansion is so important. And that's the thing that we want to, those of us who are involved in helping support the mansion, just want to develop that all the more. Because that's where you get the real feel of the way it was and the feel of the importance of the history that's involved. That's a good illustration.
Well, thank you very much.